We are starting baseball card stories, and we're going to start off today with the stolen base king and one of my all-time favorite stories of Ricky Henderson, who had one heck of a great career. Spent the first part of it mostly with the A's and then bounced around to, well, here he's with Boston, but he bounced around from Toronto to Boston to the Mets to the Yankees and probably a few stop. Oh, he was with the Padres for a while. So he was all over, um, again, spending most of his time in the American League. But okay, the story for Ricky Henderson is this. Back in the early 90s, when the Toronto Blue Jays were making the World Series and winning the World Series in 92 and 93, I believe in the 93 year, Ricky Henderson joined the Toronto Blue Jays, and John Olerud was the first baseman. And you may or may not realize when John Olerud was in the field, he would wear a batting helmet. I think that a ball might have hit him when he was playing first base, and then he just continued that practice moving forward, wearing sort of a safety hat, sort of the way the first and third base coaches do now in baseball. So fast forward rather to, I believe, the late 90s. I want to say Ricky Henderson might have been on the Mets in that 99 years, somewhere around there. And he's playing with John Olerud. And this just tells you sort of how Ricky was caught up in Ricky, and not necessarily the teams he played on. So he played with Olerud in the early 90s. We're going to the late 90s. Olerud and Ricky are on the Mets together. And Ricky turns to Olerud, um, I think in between innings or in the locker room, something like that, and says, I played with a guy in Toronto who used to wear a helmet in the field. And I believe Olerud's response was something along the lines of, "Yeah, I know it was me," but it's one of my favorite stories of Ricky Henderson because it just shows that Ricky was really caught up in Ricky. So let's go move to the next card I have for tonight's festivities. It's a Mike Scott card, and the reason why I have Mike Scott here is really two reasons. In 1986, he pitched something like 275 innings. He totaled 306 strikeouts. And I think because of that, and maybe even the 85 season, he was on, and this is more nostalgia than anything else, but Mike Scott was like the official major leaguer of the official wiffle ball, and he was on all of the boxes when you used to buy wiffle balls back in the 80s. And I just remember, I think to this day I have a wiffle ball in a box with Mike Scott on it in some collectible bin, because back then I thought anything with a major leaguer might be worth something, but we all know that it's not really worth much more than you could get at a flea market at this point. Okay, next card. The next card, and I have a few of these in here, is more about the guy's name than anything else. I just think that Schindewolf, Eric Schindewolf, for a baseball player, is one heck of a powerful name. So it's just a name that you don't see too much. Apparently, he was a first-year player in 2005. For the Diamondbacks, I don't really think he went too far anywhere, but just a great name. Now here we go with a card, if I can get it in here. Remember back in the day, in 97, Denny's came out with cards, and if you ordered, I think it was the Grand Slam meal, you got these 3D cards, and they didn't really do anything other than, have a separation between the foreground and the, background kind of thing. But so Barry Larkin here is all clear, and the players and coaches behind him are kind of, well, not kind of, they're blurry. So that was one. Another great card that captured a moment, of kind of a famous moment in baseball history, was Joe Niekro getting caught when he had, I believe it was a file tucked away somewhere in his jersey or his hat. And even on this card, this is a classic card. It was part of a card game, which was basically a uh, baseball trivia that came out in the mid 80s. But it captures that moment that he got caught. You can even see where they have the umpire in the background, another umpire right here. And that's when he basically grabbed whatever he was using, the file, I think it was, threw it away uh, as the umpires approached. Okay, now we have Bob Gibson, and I'm trying to think because I put this all together, and we have Bob Gibson as a player, and you got to remember the one thing with Bob Gibson was he put up some big numbers in 1968. He was a wonderful pitcher back then for the St. Louis Cardinals. I'm going to move on. Here's another great story, much better than the Bob Gibson one. Fernando Valenzuela. Fernando Valenzuela, when he was about 40 years old, the Dodgers wanted to have a bobblehead night for Fernando Valenzuela. And Fernando would not agree to allowing the Dodgers to create a bobblehead for him unless or until he got a tryout with the team. And that was at the age of 40. And they had to politely say to him that they didn't think that that would be the best idea, if you would, to have him try out for the team at age 40. He didn't have much gas in the tank, but that was his negotiating ploy back then, right around 99, 2000. Here's a famous player that you might recognize. These are some Kmart cards that came out in 87. This is Darryl Strawberry. Darryl Strawberry obviously started with the New York Mets, great team. He won the World Series in 86. But from a local angle, at least, I'm from the St. Louis area. Apparently, Darryl Strawberry had a romance in the St. Louis area, and and fathered a child in the St. Louis area. So whenever he got up to bat in the 80s in St. Louis, rather than the chance of Daryl that they sometimes would have at Shea Stadium in New York, they would have Daddy, or they would serenade him out in right field where he played with Daddy rather than Daryl because of what happened here in St. Louis. Okay, on another story here, this is Eddie Murray. Um, Obviously, a great hitter. I think he has 500 home runs. He's hit several home runs from both right and left side of the plate. He was a switch hitter. The little story behind this one is I was in airport. I want to say possibly New York or Atlanta. This is 15 years ago or so, and I saw him sitting by himself waiting for a plane. As I approached him, he said, "Oh no, not one of you guys." And I just started talking to him, and I eventually did, of course, ask for his autograph. But he was very nice once he got over the fact that I was approaching him and I had recognized him. Um, Now, this card I have here is only really because I had a 3D card earlier, but this shows sort of what in the early, or I guess mid to late 90s, they were doing more experiments, if you will, with 3D cards. So this is Jason Giambi's swing. So there he is waiting for it in his stance. And let's see if I can get this right. Okay. Nope, that's not right. Anyway, this doesn't really play well. Okay. The card here, if you notice, is the Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann card back in the 90s. I just have it here because, they're obviously not even with ESPN anymore, but it was one of those sort of crossovers that Upper Deck did back in the day. Will Clark is the next player. The story I have with the Will Clark card is back in the 80s, there was a huge fight between the Giants and the Cardinals. I was actually at the game. Will Clark slid into second base, hard into Jose Oquindo, and I think Ozzie Smith actually jumped up and kind of sucker punched Will Clark, who was much larger than him. Fast forward to, let me look at the date here, 2000. That was the mid 80s. Fast forward to 2000, and Will Clark had signed with the Cardinals. They needed a first baseman because Mark McGwire got hurt. And Jose Oquindo, I believe, I don't think he was playing anymore, but he was a coach on the team. So probably a few awkward moments there in the clubhouse when Will Clark joined Jose Oquindo. Let's see. Okay, now this next card, while not a famous brand, this is kind of an off-brand TCM MA. They did a lot of minor league players. Well, this is a picture of Dave DeBuscher, who played for the Chicago White Sox. And you're saying, Tom, who cares? Who's Dave DeBuscher? Who cares? Well, Dave DeBuscher is actually a two-sport athlete. While he played for the Sox, he decided shortly thereafter that he would stay in with basketball. He played for the Detroit Pistons and had much success with the New York Knicks. So he was one of those guys who was able to successfully cross over and play for the Knicks. I want to say that he might have been on the team that won the championship in the early 70s. All right. Then we have another player here. This is another sort of Homer story by me. This is Pablo. Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm trying to get content. I'm trying to get stories behind everything. So thank you for that. You know, I love sort of the backstories of some of the players. What I want to look for too is, I want to talk to people or find out, like best hairstyles and best uniforms and do all kinds of things. But right now I'm kind of telling some stories, showing some cards that either I know a story about or that they have good stories. But real quick on Al Hrabowski, here he's in Kansas City, but he's most known for the Cardinals. He was a relief pitcher back before sort of relief pitchers were as sexy as they are now, before Tony La Russa changed everything in the late 80s. But he was known as, this is what his nickname was, the Mad Hungarian. And I'll never forget about, oh my God, 30 years ago, I want to say that I walked into a local grocery store because I'm in St. Louis and this is where he was famous. I walked into a local grocery store just to, I don't know, buy something. It wasn't even beer or anything. It was just like bread. I walked in and Al Hrabowski was at a table by himself, like signing autographs on some cheesy photo they had of him. So it was, so I got an autograph of Al Hrabowski in a grocery store. So kind of an interesting story there. Let's see here. Oh, just real quick on this one. For those who may not remember, Dennis Boyd has one of the greatest nicknames in all of baseball. Now, I don't know who's all on the line, how old everyone is, but he is Dennis Oil Can Boyd is his nickname and one of the best ever. $900. What is $900 for his nickname? Is that what you're saying, John? I'm trying to read some of the chat while I do this, but I just have this one here because of his great nickname, Oil Can Boyd. And then let's see, what do I have here? Well, here's one. This is another nickname. This is Mark Fidrich. It's an 81 Fleer card. However, he was most known for some things he did in the 70s. His nickname was The Bird. He was Mark the Bird Fidrich. He was kind of known to be kind of eccentric. He had one really good season for the Tigers, and that's when he went 19-9 in 76 with a 2.34 ERA. He had 97 strikeouts and 53 walks, but that was a great year for him, and he never really got back to that level ever again. So now this is one of my favorite players, and probably no one knows who it is. Okay, it's UL Washington. And I used to think this is one of those butterfly effects or something. I used to think that he had always a toothpick. And I don't know. Let me see if I can, coming out of his mouth right here. You can see something out of his mouth and right here. And I think in a card, he does have a toothpick. These look like, to me, sunflower seeds that he would rest on his lips. But what's interesting is these are obviously two different baseball cards, but on both cards, he has this weird sort of, it looks like a sunflower seed. Now, I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's a paper clip, but it's something that looks rounded. You can see it a little bit better in here, but he's pictured in a lot of trading cards with something in his mouth. There's a couple, I think, with a toothpick, but here it looks like a sunflower seed. Just an interesting kind of card. Okay, then we have Jack Clark, who was one of my favorite players growing up. I'm from the St. Louis area, so I like Jack Clark in the mid 80s when he was traded over here with the Cardinals. He had a big home run against the Dodgers. He then signed with the Yankees. I believe, declared bankruptcy somewhere between the Yankees and Boston because he owned a racing team, like a car racing team, and so he, he had sort of this checkered financial background. But I remember about 10 years ago, I was at this famous burger place in St. Louis, and Jack Clark just happened to be there. And I was asking him about his famous home run against the Dodgers, and I said, the announcer said when you hit it that you knew that it was out of the ballpark, that it left Dodger Stadium. And I said, "Is that true?" And he said to me that, yeah, no, definitely. He knew as soon as he hit it that it was a home run. So he was a lot of fun because back then we had Whitey Herzog as a manager who I loved, but it was all small ball. It was all, stealing bases, bunts. We didn't have a home run hitter like Jack Clark, so he brought a lot of excitement to the ballpark. Okay, and this is just something silly. And I think Fleer made a card of this, but they had the Royals had Bud Black and Vida Blue, and so they made a card at some point, I believe, that said black and blue, and so I just wanted to show that. It was just something interesting. Okay, Greg Jeffries. Now he's someone that probably not too many people remember. He started with the Mets, I think, then went to Kansas City. Then the Cardinals had him for a bunch of years. He was a middle infielder when he came up. He was a first baseman with the Cardinals. One of the stories behind Greg Jeffries was the fact that his father would throw him batting practice and he would put numbers on the balls, and he would have Greg yell out the numbers as he batted as to what ball was coming. Obviously, they used a thick black magic marker, but he had to tell his dad what number was being pitched to him. So he was really watching the ball and he could see the spin and he could read it. And everybody thought he was going to be phenomenal, but I just don't think that his body always held up. He was a shorter guy. He just never really batted as high. Let's see on here, 270 something, 280 something. He batted 320, but in 29 games, but he just never really had the batting average that everybody thought he would have. Okay. Oh, this is just something to throw out there for our coastal friends. Just a reminder that Johnny Damon didn't start with the Yankees, didn't start with the Boston Red Sox. That yes, he came up with the Kansas City Royals. That's where he was. He was a great player for them, and I think that's what led him to go to Boston. But he did come up with the Royals and put up some really good, solid numbers, batting 300, having 20 to 30 stolen bases. Let's see here. Okay. Okay. Now, on this next card, you may or may not remember Chuck Knobloch. He came up as a Minnesota Twin, and he was a second baseman. But does anybody remember sort of the story behind him? He got the yips later in his career. I think what happened was he was with the Twins, then he playing second base, and then he moved to the Yankees playing second base, and for whatever reason he could not throw the ball to first base anymore. So by the time years later, by the time he made it to Kansas City, if you notice, he's an outfielder here. Let me, rather than using my fingers, he was an outfielder here. So obviously he didn't have to deal with the throws to first base, but that was one of the reasons that almost made him get out of baseball years earlier, was because of the yips throwing to first base. Okay. If you Larry Walker, great player with Colorado, had a couple good seasons or one good season with the Cardinals, but he's actually numbered 33, and he was extraordinarily superstitious, and he always had to be number 33. Just a kind of a small note there. Okay, we talked about Dave DeBusschere, who played for the White Sox, but was more known for playing for the New York Knicks. Here we have Danny Ainge. And yes, if you follow NBA basketball, is he with Utah now? I want to say Danny Ainge. But JG did not know that, but enjoyed his game prior to the yips. Yeah, he was a great player. Hello, Gaming with Chase. Danny Angel, I believe, is the GM or the president of basketball operations for Utah. I believe he was with the Celtics, and I think he moved to Utah a year or two ago. But yes, he was a two-sport athlete. Yes, he played for the Blue Jays, and he was a second baseman, which you got to figure he was a pretty tall second base. He was a 6'4" second baseman. And this is from 1980. He played in 38 games. He had 0 home runs. He batted 243. So he probably picked a better sport, but he, unlike Michael Jordan, made it to the major leagues. Okay. Now this is I throw in here, not everyone is a wonderful story. I just like this guy's name. I don't even know if he's playing anymore, but his name is Cash. First name's Cash. His last name's Case. So his name is Cash Case. And I just think that it's a wonderful name that his parents came up with for him. Okay, this is a card from 1975. Daryl Thomas. He bounced around with several teams, but the look of this player. My question is: are these sunglasses are the first version of those glasses that would be like sunglasses when you went outside, and then when you go inside, they would lose that darkness. That's what they look like to me. I've always thought that this is a really interesting card because to me, they don't look like regular sunglasses. They look like, I forget what they're called, but those two-way glasses that would change when you walked inside. Um, just two cards here that I think are kind of a sign of the times, or sign of the times at the time. You have the Kansas City Royal here, Mondesi, with his mask on, obviously not covering his nose like he should. And then Guerrero providing some hand sanitizer for the catcher here in Toronto. So just kind of an interesting, you'll probably never see cards like this again. I'm hoping, I'm guessing, but these are interesting cards, kind of these are cards that I would say that are this is a regular baseball card, for this player, Mondesi, but it shows the times, kind of has a history to it, or a history lesson in it. Okay, now for one of my favorite kind of players, Antonio Alfonseco. Can anybody? Well, um, yeah, the Walker was on the 94 Montreal Expos. What a great team. I mean, just think about who they had on that team. The Randy Johnson, Walker. I don't think Guerrero was up yet, but just a monster team that probably would have won it all if it wasn't for the strike that year. But Antonio Alfonseco, he, I believe, and I counted here, he has 6 fingers on each hand. That's sort of his claim to fame. You can see 2 fingers here, a thumb, and then what looks to be 3 fingers, a pinky, like a ring finger, and another finger right there, if I can get it right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the thumb would make it 6. And he had 6 fingers on each hand, just kind of an oddity. Now, here's a card that I teased last night for anybody who actually was watching on the football. This is one of my favorite cards from growing up. It's a 1983 Fleer. Joel Youngblood played on 2 teams on the same day. He played for the Mets in a day game. He was traded, I think, during that game to the Expos, flew up to Montreal and played. What makes this even more unique, because players have played on 2 teams, he had a hit for each team. He's the only player to have hits for 2 different teams on the same day. Because most of the time when people are traded, they don't make that second game. Okay. I did have a short video about Wade Boggs. This is a 1987 leaders card. It's kind of smaller than the others. But Wade Boggs had his glove for 20 or 30 years. I think he won only a couple gold gloves, but he had that glove forever. At one point, someone had stolen it. You'll have to watch the short on Wade Boggs' glove that I put together, but it is very interesting. At one point, it was stolen. They got the cops involved. There was a whole sort of chase to find out who had it and get the glove back. Okay, now Craig Console, who is now the Cubs manager, he was the Brewers manager. He won a World Series with the Marlins. Was that in 03, I want to say? Anyway, he was a great player and he played for Arizona for a number of years. And back in the day, many, many moons ago, I did a lot of work with a company that sponsored the Los Angeles Dodgers. So I was on the field one day and I got to talking with Craig Console because I remembered that he went to Notre Dame and it was in the fall. So I was talking to him about the football team. So he was a super nice guy. I think he's a wonderful manager. I think he did great things with the Brewers. I think he's going to be tough in the NL Central with the Cubs. I think he's a smart guy, who's a really good manager and seems to really have a good control of his team. Now, this card I have next is just basically because it's such a weird card. Obviously, Robin Yount and Paul Molitor were the shortstop and third base tandem of the Brewers, but just a weird, they pixelated it to almost conjoin or unconjoin these two. Just a horrible card by Topps with these back to back. I hated that card. Okay, this is just a real quick one, everyone. Another great name. If you look right here, I don't know if you can see it. His first name is Chad. His last name is Chop. He's Chad Chop. Just a great kind of name. I'm trying to pick those out for everyone. I see we lost a few people on that one. I knew we might. Okay, Neil Allen. Why is Neil Allen here? Well, I'm from St. Louis. And if you're a Mets fan, if you're a New York fan, you'll remember that Keith Hernandez was a famous Met. Well, Keith Hernandez started out as a Cardinal. Keith Hernandez fell out of friendship with the manager back in the day for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to go into it. But they were out of favor. And so they wanted to essentially kind of dump Keith Hernandez because he was having some problems. You may or may not remember that the Pittsburgh